Yeah, that's an excellent question. In recent years, especially with regards to clinical trials of cancer drugs, it appears that clinical trials are losing sight of what matters to patients most. And I prefer to call it common sense in oncology. I think we are losing our common sense because our clinical trials are designed to test trivial things in most cases. We are not testing whether our cancer drugs are improving patients' lives in terms of both the length of life and the quality of life they have. So if in our clinical trials, we are not testing whether a patient with cancer lives longer as a result of our drugs or lives better as a result of our drugs, then what exactly are we testing? And most of our clinical trials, we're using surrogate endpoints, despite knowing the fact that these surrogate endpoints do not translate to clinical benefit. There are several studies showing the lack of validation of surrogate endpoints with clinical endpoints. And despite those studies, we continue to use surrogate endpoints. And sometimes we don't even use a randomized trial. We just approve our drugs based on single arm trials, based on responses. So in a sense, we are losing sight of what matters to our patients. We are forgetting that the ultimate goal is to help our patients live longer and better lives, and we are just getting entangled in the journey itself. One of our recent papers in Nature Medicine, we wrote about common sense in oncology. So we need to bring common sense back into oncology. We need to take a step back and think, are we actually helping our patients? What are we achieving from these trials? And we need to think how we can design meaningful trials, how we can conduct patient-centric trials, and how we can improve patient outcomes as a result. That does not mean all trials are bad. There are some good trials, but what we see is that the majority of cancer drug trials in particular are losing sight of what matters to patients. In fact, this is the topic of my talk at ASCO 2022 on Friday during our cancer ground search session. My topic is exactly on this issue of, can participation in clinical trials of new cancer drugs help low and middle income countries address this problem of lack of access to new drugs. And what we have seen is, in recent years, there are more and more international trials being conducted in low and middle income countries. But if we look closely about these trials, what we see is a number of ethical and scientific issues that bothers me. One is the control arm. In most of these drug trials, the control arm is a treatment that is not used in high-income countries, because these are the trials of what we call Me Too cancer drugs. These are not novel molecules. These are Me Too version of drugs that we already know to work. So let's say we know that pembrolizumab works very well in patients with non-small cell lung cancer, but there are newer PD-1 inhibitors or PD-L1 inhibitors like pembrolizumab, and they want to test the same question again. Is our drug effective in non-small cell lung cancer? But obviously, no institution in high-income countries would enroll their patients in such trials because the control arm is chemotherapy. And we already know that immunotherapy is far more better than chemotherapy for such patients. So nobody would enroll their patients to a control arm of chemotherapy. So now what they are doing is they are opening up these trials in low and middle income countries because they can still get away with a chemotherapy control arm. And when the trial finishes, they prove that their newer immunotherapy is better than chemotherapy. So scientifically, that's of no use to us because we already know that. We already know that immunotherapy is better than chemotherapy. But they argue that the control arm is still justified because in low and middle income countries, patients were not having access to immunotherapy anyway. But the question is, based on the Helsinki principle, the control arm of a trial should be the best standard of care, not the local standard of care, A. And B, it would have still been justified if the patients in those low and middle income countries would have access to these newly tested immunotherapy drugs even after the trial is complete. But there are studies showing that for several years, even after the trial is complete and the drug gets approved back in high income country, these drugs are not available in low and middle income countries. So in a sense, we are just using patients from low and middle income countries to complete our trial because that trial does not get approved in high income country. And then we show that the drug is effective and get the drug approved back in high income countries. So that's a classical example of research parasitism or research parasitism that we talk about in global health. So if we cannot ensure continued access to that newly tested molecule in low and middle income countries, just using the patients in low and middle income countries to get a drug approved in high income countries is highly unethical, in my opinion. A better way forward, as I propose in my talk, is to conduct a non-inferiority trial. If we conduct a non-inferiority trial against the established molecule, then at least patients in either arm will get a drug that is effective, and we will not be knowingly randomizing a patient to a control arm that is already proven to be poor. The theme of our session at ASCO 2022 is called Cancer Groundset. Cancer Groundset is a phrase that I coined back in 2016. And after that, we published about it in Lancet Oncology, in ASCO book, in other newspapers. So Cancer Groundset is a philosophy that says we should focus on improving access to treatments that are already proven to work, as opposed to Cancer Moonset, which is focusing on development of newer molecules, newer interventions to help improve cancer survival. But the philosophy behind Cancer Groundset is, what did the data say? The data says that if you look across the world, half of the patients with cancer who need cancer surgery do not have access to surgery. More than 90% of patients in low-income countries who need radiation do not have access to radiation. There is a problem with pathology services. There is no availability of IHC for proper diagnosis of a tumor in several countries in the world. And the access with pain medications for palliative care is, again, there is a huge disparity between countries. When that's the scenario, I don't think we can, cancer moonset our way to global cancer control. We can't be proud of developing new molecules when patients in the world are not having access to these classical or curative treatments that we already know to work. Patients in my country, if they do not have access to a classic oral chemotherapy like cisplatin or paclitaxel, then I don't see much point in being happy about discovery of newer molecules for global cancer control. Of course, discovery of new molecules is important. Don't get me wrong. Cancer moonset type interventions are important, but not at the cost of forgetting Cancer Groundset. A drug is as effective as a drug is effective only if there are patients who are able to take them. If the patients cannot take them, then that drug cannot save lives. So we need to start focusing on Cancer Groundset philosophy, Cancer Groundset type interventions, so that we can ensure that whatever developments we make, whatever scientific progress we make, actually reach patients and actually help improve outcomes for our patients and actually help to address some part of the global cancer burden.